let me start by showing you this. I got this in the mail this morning from Scientific America. They have this article, A Vision for the Next Decade of Human Genomics Research. Now, what are the types of research involving genetics will be done, and numerous genomic application, non-invasive prenatal genetic testing, DNA-based forensic, direct-to-consumer and sensory information, genetic disease diagnostics, and SARS-CoV-2 virus surveillance, among others. They have a PDF that I will download and send to you, and it's very pertinent because most of the genetic research will be done on stored tissue samples or biospecimens, and that's the nature of our topic today. What are the ethical issues involved with doing research on biospecimens? So let me start with that. And here's the code again. So we'll discuss today some definitions involving research. What is human subject research from a regulatory point of view? What is exempt research? Why is there a new emphasis on biological specimens, which I just mentioned about the genomics revolution? What is secondary research with biospecimens and data? And I want to emphasize the combination of doing research on specimens and data. And then we'll discuss the concept of broad consent and its concerns. So let me review some current concepts. What is the definition of research? Essentially, it involves a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. The two most important words here in this definition is systematic investigation. So essentially, you have a plan on what you're going to collect and analyze. And then the other word is generalizable, which is a somewhat ambiguous word. So one could say widespread information or knowledge that is generalizable to similar situations, similar to the research project itself. So if a hospital is investigating some infectious control aspect of their hospital, and they're collecting data about resistant organisms, that may not be considered research. It may be considered, what I'm trying to say, infection control at their hospital, which may not be generalizable to other hospitals, and hence one could say that collection of data is not considered generalizable knowledge. And it gets particularly difficult when you try to distinguish research from public health activities, which may or may not be considered research. That is a subject for another day. More importantly, I like to go over the definition of research involving human subjects from a regulatory point of view. What I'm trying to say is that, well, human subject research involves collecting data from individuals, but sometimes how you collect the data or how you store the data may not be considered human subject research, and hence not amenable to full IRB review by a research ethics committee. So here's the definition of human subject research: research involving living individuals about whom the researcher obtains information. Yes, right. So on one hand, obtains information through an intervention or an interaction with the individual prospectively. So you're interacting with the individual, like doing an interview, focus group, survey research, or you're getting data from an intervention, blood sample, MRI, CAT scan, and so forth. Is observation research considered an interaction? What do you think? How many people thumbs up? Is observation an interaction? Is that considered? And you're obtaining information. How many people say yes? I guess, how many people say no? No, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it depends how you define interaction. Whether
okay,
that's
well, I'm trying to unpack that word interaction by asking you: is observation considered an interaction? I agree with you. It depends on how you define interaction. I don't know how to define that word, so I'm giving some examples.
So for me, I guess an interaction I would think of a two-way. You know, that there's interaction is a two-way. It's bidirectional.
Oh, bidirectional. Okay.
Between two objects or two people, whereas someone could be observing someone without them knowing they're being observed.
Okay, so are you saying if it's unidirectional, then that is not research?
No, I think it definitely is research. I think, but both examples, prospective or retrospective, is definitely research. You're collecting data, and then I guess whether the data collection is prospective, it's happening in the future, whether that requires any physical contact or interaction with the individual. You know, you interview them, they fill a questionnaire for you, or it's retrospective, you're going back through the medical records. But I would definitely say both are research.
Okay, so I mean, you're obtaining data, and I would challenge you and ask you, why does it have to be bidirectional?
Just the term interaction to me, I think of something. An interaction would be, you know, two objects coming into contact with each other, or. But I have to go and check the definition now. Okay,
well, while you're checking that, what about if you're obtaining data through the internet and you're lurking in a chat room? Is that considered? Well, first, let me ask you: is that considered research?
I think if you're collecting data on anyone and using it to answer a research question for science or then I would consider it research.
Right. Yeah. So maybe this definition. I mean, this definition was developed 2 decades ago before the internet, but certainly we were observing people even that time. So I'm just highlighting the concept that prospectively, if we obtain data from individuals through an intervention or an interaction, which for the sake of definition could include observation or internet chat rooms, that would be considered research. So now, the other way to obtain data is retrospectively. If we obtain identifiable private information, that is considered human subject research. Now, if we obtain non-identifiable information from a regulatory point of view, that's not considered human subject research. If the information is publicly available, that is not considered human subject research from a regulatory point of view and does not need to be subject to research regulations. At least that's how we do it in the US. I don't know the specifics of your regulations involving whether the research is considered human subject research or not from a regulatory point of view. So we'll let's see how we apply that. So we have this case study here. Okay, so we have this case. An application describes the following proposed research activities. Investigators will obtain human specimens for basic research from a pathologist who has previously collected the tumor specimens from previous cancer patients. The pathologist will de-identify the data so that the investigators will not know the identities of the samples. So question, are the recipient investigators conducting human subject research? So why don't you vote? All right, so 7 out of 10 voted, and you're all saying yes. Now remember, they're getting de-identified data. Hint. All right, okay. One, thank you. One no. Well, the answer is no. The recipient investigators are not conducting human subject research from a regulatory point of view because they're receiving existing de-identified data. There is no way they can ever access the identities of the samples. So again, I don't know about the regulations in the UAE, but commonly it is thought that if you're doing research on de-identified data, it's not considered human subject research. Think about it. What harms could come to the individuals if you don't know the identities? And from a regulatory point of view, the Research Ethics Committee is not obligated to review that type of research. Now, the investigators should send their proposal to the IRB or the Research Ethics Committee, and it's up to the Ethics Committee to determine whether the research involves non-human subject research. And then the IRB could say, thank you very much, but your research is not subject to the regulations. Again, I don't know if your regulations has that specific definition. So what is meant by existing data? Data that have already been collected at the time the proposal has been conceived. Existing data have been collected for purposes other than the proposed research and applies to retrospective studies involving already collecting data. So you could think of it as data already on the shelf when the proposal or protocol is initiated. Okay, another case study. An application describes the following proposed research activities. Investigators want to obtain human specimens for basic research from a surgeon at another hospital. The surgeon will collect prospectively surgical specimens at the request of the investigators that would otherwise be discarded and provide the data to the investigators in a coded fashion. And the investigators will know the code so they could link back to the specimens and its identities. So are we dealing with existing data in this proposal? Data that have already on the shelf? Is this prospective or retrospective?
It's prospective.
Prospective.
Right, we'll collect it prospectively. Okay. And the surgeon will have no other involvement. So are the recipient investigators conducting human subject research? Yes or no, or not sure? Okay, we're up to 6, 7. All right. And the answer is yes, they are. They are getting data in a coded fashion, but also it's prospective, involving an intervention or an interaction, and hence, even if the data was de-identified, the mere fact that there was an interaction means that you're dealing with human subject research. So an investigator involved in the research, the surgeon is collecting specimens from living individuals for this study. And the recipient investigators can readily link the specimens to the living individuals. Now, is the surgeon conducting human subject research? The one who's collecting the specimens, but will not be involved in the analysis of the research? Yes, no, right. Yeah. Another way to ask is the surgeon engaged in a research activity? So sometimes that could be ambiguous, but I think most research ethics committee would say yes. The surgeon is interacting with living individuals, collecting data, and hence the surgeon, him or herself, is also involved in the research. So
just to ask a quick question on that. So with that particular situation, you would require consent from the patient because it's not a routinely collected sample. So they're only collecting it for research purposes.
Yes, right. You would need research consent. Now, that's a very good question because I am aware of times when a patient, I'll give you a specific example. A patient is undergoing bronchoscopy for clinical reasons, and the investigator asks his buddy, the pulmonologist, oh, why don't you get me some extra lavage fluid for my research study? And sometimes they don't ask the patient specifically for research consent. And sometimes if they ask the ethics committee may say, okay, we could waive the consent. Now, according to the regulations, there's no reason to waive the consent. There's no reason not to ask the patient for consent to participate in the research study. And so that's a very important question to ask about when you could waive research consent. But you should get consent from the patient for anything prospectively. So another case, an application describes the following research activities. An investigator obtains individually identifiable information on treatment outcomes of patients treated in the past with 2 different approved drugs by accessing retrospectively the medical records. The investigator records the treatment outcomes in a coded manner so that the patients can later be identified in case they want to go back to the medical records and get more data. So are the investigators conducting human subject research? They're accessing retrospectively. Okay, so everyone is saying yes, and the answer is yes. The investigator is conducting human subject research because they're obtaining identifiable private information about living individuals, and they're recording the data in a coded manner. However, according to the regulations, at least the regulations in the US, if they record the data without identifiable information, that is now considered exempt research. Now, do you have something similar in the UAE regarding exempt research? I don't know your regulations involving what you consider to be exempt or not. Do you have exempt categories?
We exempt some studies if, again, if they don't contain identifiable information. Like, for example, they're looking at certain patients with certain disease, for example, the number of cases So it's a case-by-case basis. It depends. They come to us and then we decide based on, we ask them what information you're looking for, and then we can give them exemption. But we don't have an official exemption letter.
Do you have formal exemption categories?
Not a formal category, but yeah.
I'm sorry?
Not a formal category that is published, but we deal with it case by case.
Case by case.
Yes.
So different IRBs could have different practices?
No, I mean, like, for example, if we have, sometimes we get asked by researchers if they need to apply for an IRB approval or not. And then when we ask them what type of information you're collecting, and if we know that the information is not identifiable and the information is, for example, general information or available information, then we tell them you don't need to apply. And in our website, we have a certain, like a general statement where any research involving human subjects, you would need to apply for an IRB approval.
Right. Okay. Well, let me.
And we have a policy as well, an internal policy for human subject research, which is
Hamda, we generally speaking, these people will apply, and we rarely exempt a study basically because it's without identifiable information. We rarely, unless it is more of a quality improvement project, or if it is not a research. Any research, even if it is not, even if it is without identifiable information, we tend to go through it.
Yeah, but sometimes they don't apply. Yeah, before application, before you review it, when it comes to our section. So here we tell them that you don't need to apply before the committee reviews.
I don't know, but I know whatever reaches us, even if it is without identifiable information, we still go through it and look through all the elements, and they don't get exempted unless there's something happening before it reaches us. I don't know about it. Now, the only thing we exempt, if it looks like a quality improvement project in any area of the hospital setup, then it doesn't come to us.
Right. Well, who makes the determination whether the project is research or quality improvement?
Who decides from the beginning? What happens is that when the researcher applies for the ethical approval, Mrs. Maida, who's the coordinator for the committee, looks at the type of research, and then sometimes, if it's an audit, she would inform them that this is an audit and it doesn't require ethical approval. If she needs more clarification, or she needs us to assist her in making this decision, then she raises the issue to us. And if I cannot make the decision myself, I raise it to the committee.
Okay, all right. So, which gets to the issue, what does the word exempt mean? Exempt from what?
From ethical review?
Right, review? Yes. From full board ethical review. And also it means exempt from the research regulations. But the IRB should be the ones to make that determination. So categories of exemption in the US, in our regulations, this is exemption number 3, research involving the collection of existing data or documents, records, blah, 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 if these sources are publicly available, or if the information is recorded in a way that the subjects cannot be identified directly or through identifiers linked to the subject. So even though,
Dr. Henry,
yes,
publicly means away from the, for example, from Dubai Health Authority as a facility, or publicly means in the internet? What exactly publicly means?
oh, okay, all right, good question. So yeah, let's say the information is on the internet.
So this is public.
Yes, it's public.
What
Oh.
what if it is within the network of the facility? Is it public?
If it's publicly available, if anybody could access the information
No,
without a
it's not
password, blah, 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 stuff like that.
not anybody, only the medical staff who has the access to the system.
Oh, well, then it's not publicly
Not
available.
public, yeah, it's not public.
Thank you very much. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. All right, so, so the, let me think, so the reason why we have these categories of non-human subject research and exempt research is the concept of proportionate review. When we have, if we can't identify the specimens, or if the research are in an exempt category, there's minimize this. What I'm trying to say is that there is minimal prospective or potential harm to the subject welfare and rights. And hence, the concept of proportionate review states that you want the IRBs, with all the work they have to do, to spend more time on the high-risk studies and studies that doesn't involve human subjects from a regulatory point of view, or that involves exempt research, only requires minimal review or no review at all. You have a IRB analyst or administrator looking at the protocol and says, listen, we don't have to review this protocol. You got other protocols. You got COVID research to review, and you don't have to spend your time reviewing a whole protocol if the information is de-identifiable. So again, the whole reason to have this concept of non-human subject research and exempt research is deals with the concept of proportionate review. You need to spend your time reviewing the higher risk categories of research. So I just wanted to get those basic definitions out. Exempt research could also involve survey research, in which surveys that are anonymous, those are considered exempt research as well, according to the US regulations. I don't know about your regulations.
So, Professor Henry, do you mean that research projects such as retrospective, that they collect data from data record systems, does not require ethical approval?
If it's recorded in a non-identifiable manner.
Well, it's recorded with name information, everything, the age group, everything is there, plus the investigation outcomes.
If you record it in such a way that you could identify it in the future, then it's not exempt.
Okay.
That's a very important point, because when we get to biospecimen research, which we're gonna start talking about now. Let me just say that many times it's very important to collect the data along with the biospecimens, and you may want to report identifiable data because you may want to follow up the health information in the future. So if you're recording if you're reporting data that could be identifiable, it's not exempt. However, if you're doing biospecimen research and you get health data from the patients, but it's non-identifiable, then that's exempt research. But many times, the value of the research is increased if you collect data from the records in which you could follow the health data later on. That's more valuable research, and hence that's not considered exempt research. So I want to get these definitions discussed up front.
Prof. Henry, are you able to read the chat comments?
Oh, okay. Let me access the chats where. Whoops. Oh, I lost my. Okay, what are you guys saying?
I see different people making comments in the group.
Data. So, well, which one?
It's mainly related to data that's identifiable.
Identifiable.
And I think for me, it's not clear whether, for example, when the data is extracted, there could be identifiers, but it's never reported. It's normally reported at group level, or even if it was a clinical case series, or it would be de-identified. But I think we tend to treat even projects that are or applications that are reporting de-identified data or retrospective. We normally go through the protocol.
Well, if the data have been recorded such that you could identify the patients, then it's identifiable.
So if it's extracted from the medical record and it's got an MRN number, but are you saying recorded or if it's reported?
Yes.
Oh, let's say you go back to the medical records, you record potassiums, sodiums, chest x-ray, but you leave out the MRN number. You leave off the names, the address, in such a way that you can never identify the patient. So you have recorded it in a de-identified manner. And that could be considered exempt research.
That's what usually happens when you publish. You don't publish the name or the MRN or any other codes. You don't just publish the results, positive, negative, number of positive, number of negatives.
Right.
So
but
you will never report the name of the subject or the patient or the MRN number in the publication or in the report.
But the important thing is whether the investigator could still identify the patients.
Yes.
Publishing
It's different.
that's not the pivot point. It's whether the investigator could still go back and identify the patient.
But the investigators has access to the system and the system has complete information, A to Z. Has the name, the age, the address. Yeah, but he takes only the results section, and then he works the result and ignore the other information. But he has the access.
So here's the distinction. Let's say you go to the medical records. You're not part of my research team. You're just giving me data, de-identified data. I don't go to the medical records. I pay you to go to the medical records to get the data for me. You give me the data, de-identified. I have never looked at the medical records. The data I get is considered non-human subject research because I have never seen the medical records. You have given me the data in a de-identified way. So it's non-human subject research.
Okay.
Okay. Now, however, if I went to the medical record and took a look at the data, but I don't report the names, okay, that's considered exempt research. It's a fine difference.
Okay.
But in both cases, it has limited or no IRB review. And depending on, I mean, the IRB well, it may make a difference with a waiver of consent, even with exempt research. So with survey research, we still get informed consent. If we're dealing with non-human subject research, then you don't need informed consent. So there are slight differences between whether the research is considered human subject research or exempt research. But both types of research has, if you want to call it, limited IRB review. Well, we'll keep on going over these definitions. Let's get rid of this chat box.
It's in the bottom of your screen on the right.
You see it on my screen?
Yeah, near the mic.
Yes,
Yes.
the middle, the one in the middle.
There you are.
Yep.
That's the, let me just make me look at this chat box. You don't see the chat box on my screen. That's the problem.
I don't see it.
I know, but I see it, and it's interfering with my vision. All the annotation tools that I have. Okay, so getting back to human biospecimens and data research, let me just go through this quickly. It's all about precision medicine. This is all about the importance of genetic information, why human biospecimen research is important. So this type of research, we could better predict which treatment and prevention strategies will work for certain groups of individuals, and essentially identify disease patterns and help with diagnosing and treating disease in more effective ways. Also, the human biospecimen research is used to identify, validate ways to deliver drugs to specific cells, identify how diseases vary in their development and progression, group patients as more or less likely to respond to specific drugs, group patients to determine which treatment is appropriate for different stages of a disease, and also develop screening tests for certain types of illnesses. And biospecimens come from collected for a particular research study. We could use what's called leftover specimens, and we'll talk about that when we talk about collection for future unspecified research, often stored in a biobank or a research repository. We collect biospecimens from patients undergoing clinical care during treatment, and we're always collecting data from the medical records as well. So there's a lot of opportunities to collect specimens. So now, with this advent of the importance of biospecimens, we somewhat modify our definition of human subject research to include the prospective collection of biospecimens for a certain research protocol, or if the biospecimens have been collected in the past from a research study or from clinical care, and we access it retrospectively, so we add identifiable biospecimens and research on identifiable biospecimens that have been collected in the past is considered secondary research. So what are the ethical concerns with biospecimens research? We have old themes attached to new dimensions with informed consent. We're going to talk about informed consent for the use of samples for future unspecified research. Think about that. We're obtaining informed consent from patients for future unspecified research. How informed is that? We're asking sometimes informed consent for samples that have been archived. Biospecimen research have concerns for privacy of the research data. What do people want? What about community harms? What about the implication for IRB review? What are the additional elements of informed consent, which could include issues about returning research results to participants about their genetic data? What about the prospects of commercialization of the genetic samples, meaning that if the investigators or the institution gains a patent to the research, do they share the profits with the patients who donated their samples? and who owns the samples in the future. So these are all additional issues that needs to be considered. And so let's say you have for informed consent for existing biospecimens and data. If previous informed consent for the specific genetic research has been obtained, well, there's no problem. Now, what about if previous informed consent to a future project has not been obtained? You've collected the samples from one project and you didn't get consent to do research on a future project. What do you do now? Or let's say you collected the samples for a clinical purpose and the pathologist has stored the sample and now you want to do future research. So what do? What are the choices? Do you recontact the donors and ask them, hey, we want to do some another research project on your samples that we collected either for clinical care or for a previous research project, but now we want to do a different research project. So do we recontact the donors for informed consent? Or do we de-identify the samples? And then one could say, well, that's non-human subject research and we don't need informed consent. However, again, if we de-identify the samples, that could limit the value of the research because then we can't get the data, existing data. Or do we ask the IRB to waive the informed consent form, depending on what are your regulations regarding when you could waive the informed consent. In the US, we have certain criteria. The research has to be minimal risk. The research, it would be impracticable to do the research with informed consent. And there's many different definitions of what it means to be impracticable to do the research. The waiver of the consent cannot adversely affect the autonomy and privacy rights of the individuals. And essentially, what do people think about their privacy rights in such research? So those are the implications for informed consent. So again, what is secondary research? Secondary research involves use of information or biospecimens for other than the original purpose for which the information or biospecimens were initially collected through an interaction or an intervention with a living individuals, including a separate research study or non-research activity. So again, secondary research means we now have biospecimens that were either collected for clinical care or for another research project, and now we're doing another research project on the biospecimens. Now, there's lots of different ways to carry out secondary research with biospecimens and data without full board IRB review or even without informed consent. Again, if we don't have identifiers, it's considered non-human subject research, so we don't need full IRB review, and we don't need informed consent, or if it's exempt research, existing data, and if the specimens or data are publicly available or the information has been recorded without identifiers, it doesn't need full IRB review or even informed consent, or the IRB could waive the informed consent, and here are, at least in the US, the criteria for a waived consent. So there are many different ways to do secondary research without a lot of regulatory bureaucracy involved with reviewing the research. So it's very easy to do that type of research. And there's a lot of arguments in favor of this approach, and it essentially promotes research, and we don't have to track down the data sources to ask for consent later, because it may be difficult to retrospectively contact participants to ask for their informed consent. However, now all this came about, let me give you the perspective. All this came about when all this concern about how we could do secondary research on biospecimens, when the genetic, if I could call it, revolution came upon us that made research on biospecimens very, very important. 20 years ago, we weren't doing a lot of research on biospecimens, analyzing the genomics of the data, but now we do. So it has brought up a lot of issues, and a lot of the issues have brought up concerns about allowing secondary research without consent. There's been high-profile cases that has brought up heightened privacy concerns, and there's been high-profile cases that enhance the public expectations and preferences about accessing their specimens for research, and it brings up a lot of privacy concerns. So that's why we're discussing two questions. When could we do the research without informed consent? And what are the privacy issues? So the issues, one high-profile case, at least in the US, involved the case of Henrietta Lacks. She was an African-American woman in the 1950s, and she had cervical cancer, and her cells were collected from a biopsy and cultured without her knowledge or permission. And these cells were taken for research, and it produced this very important HeLa cells used in research in all the labs around the world. And in case you missed it, HeLa refers to her name, Henrietta Lacks. So not a whole lot of privacy going on here. And this became a valuable cell line for future research. However, Henrietta Lacks and her family never received any money or recognition. And Henrietta Lacks was a patient at Hopkins Hospital, and the investigators took the cells, again, without her permission, without her consent, and she was a patient in Baltimore, and Hopkins refuses to give any recognition to the family or compensation to the family. So this has caused a lot of controversy. Also, another high-profile case involved newborn blood spots, where in the U.S., when a baby is born, these blood spots are taken for newborn screening for genetic diseases. However, in certain states in the U.S., the leftover blood spots were used for research without asking permission from the families. And when the families heard about this, the parents claimed illegal search and seizure and took it to the courts, and the courts decided that the investigators had to destroy the existing samples and not do any more further research on these blood spots. So these cases brings up the issue of when and how could you access biospecimens for research and protect privacy rights. Now, another high-profile case occurred with communities. There was this Havasupai tribe in Arizona in the U.S., and they had a high rate of diabetes, approaching 50%. And they were wondering if there was a genetic link that could be located and hence provide a tool for addressing risk factors. So in the 1990s, they asked the researchers from Arizona State to collect anonymous blood samples from members of their tribe. Now, the tribal members signed a broad consent to study the causes of behavioral and medical disorders, but actually the tribal members thought they were only providing consent to do diabetes research. And the diabetes research was done, and they didn't find a genetic link. However, the researchers used the specimens in other studies, concerning schizophrenia, inbreeding, and research involving ancestry. And they didn't ask permission to do these additional research studies on the specimens they collected for the diabetes research. And one time, one of the members of the tribe was a student at Arizona State, and she was listening to a seminar where the researchers would describe their schizophrenia research and their ancestry research done on the samples from her tribal members. And she was just astonished to hear that all this research was being done on her community, and the community never gave express permission to do this secondary research on the samples. So essentially, there was a lawsuit involving unconsented research, and Arizona State University settled for money, and they had to return the specimens back to the tribal members. So, so the lesson learned that even if the individual samples are anonymized, there still could be group harms to the community with the anonymized samples. Also, there was a concern that especially with genetic data, if you combine it with large data sets, it has been shown that you could take de-identified biospecimens and you could re-identify the data sets. So that brought up another concern with these biospecimens, meaning that even now, even if the biospecimens are de-identified, because there's a possibility of re-identifying the specimens, now are you now not dealing with human subject research? And if the answer is no, do you need informed consent to do secondary research? And then the other issue, what do individuals prefer regarding the use of their existing data for another research study? Now, the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because with the advent, again, with the advent of biospecimen research and accessing existing biospecimens or collecting biospecimens for the future, the issue is, what are the issues regarding informed consent and what are the issues regarding privacy? And how could you ethically now do the research? What are the issues? What are the ethical issues in doing secondary research? When do you need informed consent? And how could you protect privacy rights of the individuals? So there's the issue of re-identification. There's the issue of privacy. And I don't have to tell you, privacy has become a big issue in many different walks of life in our societies in the last 5-10 years. So how do we protect privacy? What are the issues of informed consent? And what do individuals prefer regarding the use of their existing data for another research study? Do they want to give their informed consent when you're using their existing data? And so essentially, when the US was revising its regulations for biospecimen research, they were asking these questions. What are the issues about re-identification? What's the issues for informed consent? What are the issues for privacy? And what does the public want? So there were a few publications regarding what the public wants. So in this one case, the NIH wanted to establish a database, genotypes and phenotypes, a centralized repository for coded, de-identifiable data. And so essentially, they wanted to establish this database. And in order to achieve sufficient statistical power, they wanted large, well-characterized data sets. And hence, the NIH began to require all of its investigators to submit their previously collected de-identified data to this database. So now, if if for studies that will enroll participants prospectively, no problem. They would just ask the participants for their informed consent. Listen, we want to use your data in this database. Do we have your informed consent? Okay. But what about data that had been collected for previous studies? Okay. So what do you do now? Okay. Because the previous informed consent form did not mention the possibility of a large database repository. So now what do you do with the data that had been collected previously? So there are three choices that one could do. One, you could recontact the participants and respect their autonomy, but that would involve logistical constraints of recontacting everyone. You could de-identify the data and call it non-human subject research, and then you could not bother with the informed consent. Or you could have the IRB waive the informed consent and saying it's impracticable to recontact. Okay? So why don't you tell me, how many people think, well, in order to put the previously collected data into the new database, how many people think that we should recontact the participants? You could just do a thumbs up or de-identify the data and now call it essentially non-human subject data, or have the IRB waive the consent and say it's impracticable to recontact. What do you think? How many people would say we have to recontact everyone to use their existing data? Anybody?
I think it depends on the data that would be collected, like if it's a sensitive information or something that is like related to genetics or DNA.
Well, we're talking about, well, that's a good question. We're talking about health data, okay? You know, depending on which country, which culture, why I have found that a lot of people feel that all of their health data is sensitive. What do you think?
I would vote for recontact participants.
Okay, recontact
Participants. Recontact them. The first.
Why do you say that?
Because I think the patient has the right to be reconsented again for using that specimen. You may even use a consent that says that this specimen can be de-identified or can be reused again for other you can have even an open-end consent, so you don't have to recall them again in the future. But I think you have to start by contacting the participant and explaining to them what are you doing retrospectively in the past, the specimen that you have. And from now to the future, you keep informing the people that you can use these specimens for multiple research. If the person agrees, you got the consent. If they disagree, it's over.
Okay, now hold that thought about future research, because we'll talk about the concept of broad consent.
And because you know that whatever research you will do, if it is a bio research, it can have consequences in terms of maybe identifying things, and then maybe you will really have to call back these people and tell them what you have found. I don't know the consequences of using these specimens on the people themselves on the future. So I think you have to recontact the participants and reach as many as you can.
That's that's another important issue about recontact. Do we have an obligation to recontact? Let's leave.
Yeah,
that
unless
question.
the patient has given an open-end consent that you can use the specimen for anything, then you have really to contact participants.
We will talk in just a few minutes about the concept of having obtained a broad consent at the time we collect the biospecimens, but that's moving forward. We still have a lot of biospecimens that we have not obtained an open-ended or broad consent. So, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes.
If the patient is alive, he has to be consented. This is my opinion.
All right.
I would go for the third choice.
Me too.
Wave?
The IRB need to decide about the minimal risk to restudy this. And yes, in most of the cases, it might be impractical to contact all the participants. So if we look at the risk to see if the risk is minimal, the IRB should be able to take a decision here.
Okay, so there is this concept that I'll talk about in just a few minutes where one could waive the consent, but there has to be what's called limited IRB review.
Justifiable.
Limited IRB review to make sure that the privacy rights are protected, and also there has to be a strong data protection law in your country to enhance privacy.
I would go for the second one, non-human subject research.
Okay, now you could de-identify the data. However, that would limit the usefulness of the research because, again, what I said before, one would want to, the research would be much more valuable if you could keep on collecting the data from the records to follow, the health outcomes.
I have one question here, Professor Henry.
What's that?
What part of the demographic data considered private?
I'm sorry?
What part of the demographic data considered private? Name, age, address.
Okay.
Yeah. What's private on those data? I mean, what part of those are private, which should not be identified?
Right. Well, there's a whole list of identifiers that has to be stripped from the data set. The name, address,
date of birth,
number,
age, address.
Date of birth.
By the way, we have the definition of identifiers, patient identifiers. We have the definition. We have the list already.
Right. Yeah. You should have your own list. It could national ID number, social security number, all those data that could be instrumental in identifying the subject. So essentially, just to move this along, getting back to the database, so they did a study in which there was the study that had collected data from participants. Okay, it was called the ACT study, Adult Changes in Thought, in which they collected pre-existing data, but they were still following the patients. So they asked these patients, listen, could we use the previously collected data in this new database? And more than 90% or 86% said yes. Yes, you could use the data. And then they asked them, well, listen, was it important for us to ask you permission in order to use this data? And 90% said it was important, and they were glad that we were asked. And this was published. Glad you asked. Participants' opinions of reconsent for this database. And so, to make a long story short, essentially there was a concern that, essentially, what do people want? And studies like this were telling the regulators that the public wants to provide their consent, even if the data was de-identified. And hence, so again, we have the prospects for de-identifying the biospecimens or re-identifying the biospecimens. There were these concerns about privacy rights, and now we're accessing the public, and the public saying, we want to give our informed consent, even if the data is de-identified. So essentially, how do we balance now autonomy versus justice, or essentially balance autonomy with doing research in the public interest? And in order to do all this future genetic research. And so, what do people really want? Yes.
Sorry, can I ask you a question? With the ACT study, the dementia, so that was essentially a prospective study where they collected samples, but could you argue that they were a vulnerable population, and that perhaps depending on the time period between when you collected the samples to when you asked them the consent, whether they could fully, depending on their progression of dementia, whether they could actually provide informed consent, or whether it actually should have been a next of a spouse or a legal guardian.
Right. So I mean that's again, the NIH were asking investigators to provide their data to this database.
I understand that the dementia study started at a young age group, and they've been followed for a long time for dementia risk factors and association. So they've been consented at a very young age, and therefore I think they were fit enough to reconsent again.
Well, right. I mean, either consent from the patients themselves or from their families. But they did a study specifically to ask, what do people really want? Do they essentially, do they have a strong privacy interest in being asked for their previously collected data? And so in this study, the ACT study, they specifically, because they were following patients prospectively, they specifically asked the patients listen, we collected all these data previously. Let me back up. Some NIH studies had collected data and the study was over. So they didn't have access to the participants anymore. So the issue was, should they recontact the participants for their previously collected data and biospecimens, or could they just waive their consent? To recontact all these participants again, it would involve a lot of work. So in the ACT study, it was a longitudinal study, and they were still following the patients. So they thought, okay, let's ask the participants, let's ask them, what do people really want? Do they really care? Do they want you to ask them for their informed consent for previously collected data? And that study showed that, one, the public says, yes, you could use my data, but you got to ask us, even if it's de-identified. Even if it's de-identified. And hence the regulators were concerned that, hey, maybe we can't waive the informed consent. Maybe we do have to ask. But that was just one study. So the issue is, what do people really want? Data on public opinion, however, is not always clear, because it depends on how you ask the question. Is it okay to use your specimens for whatever purpose we want without asking you? Is it okay to use your specimens, but we promise to protect your privacy? If we promise to protect your privacy, do we need your informed consent for existing data? Do you still want control over how your specimens are used, even if the risks are low and an IRB will be involved? And also, if obtaining your informed consent would hinder medical progress? So if you ask the public, listen, we want to use your existing data, but do we need your informed consent, hypothetically? If we promise to protect your privacy, if an IRB will be involved, and getting your informed consent would hinder medical progress, do we need your informed consent? So depending on the situation, essentially, what do people really want us to do? And that's an important question to ask, because that will have an implication on how you write your regulations. So,
Professor
yes,
Henry, I think it would be quite interesting to conduct a similar study like that in the UAE, as sort of biobanking is probably likely to be more commonplace as we have, and I guess as the regulations are being developed, to understand actually what people's perceptions are of providing data and providing samples, what potentially could be done with them. So I think it'll be quite an interesting research project for here in the UAE.
Yes, it would be very interesting research to ask your population, essentially, what does your population really want? But it depends on how you ask the question, okay? If you just merely ask the question, do we need your informed consent? They may say yes. But if you say risk to privacy is low, an IRB will be involved, and obtaining your consent would hinder medical progress, then they may say, don't bother. You don't have to come back to us for informed consent. So, but I agree with you, that would be an important study to do. Now, having said that, I would, what's the word? I would recommend, if I could use that word, to take the survey I sent you on this research we're doing. We're doing this research involving these issues, and we're asking the perspectives of IRBs, investigators, and also we have a separate survey in which we're asking the public, what are their views? Exactly what you just asked. And if you want, I'm very willing to share with you the survey, the validated survey we are now doing in Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and Sudan. So actually, if you want to do that research, I'm happy to share with you the survey that we're using to access public opinion, to find out what do people really want, so that when you write your regulations, it's in tune with what people really want. So I say all this because the US went through a whole process. They proposed a rule that was going to make it very difficult, because based on these few studies about public opinion, glad you asked, re-identification, and all these high-profile cases involving privacy, the Henrietta Lacks story, the newborn screening story, the Havasupai tribe, okay? And so essentially, to make a long story short, the proposed rule was going to define a human subject to involve all biospecimens, even if it's not identifiable. And there was a lot of opposition to this proposed rule, because there was a concern that it was going to hinder research. If you were going to consider all the biospecimens as constituting human subject research, okay, you're going to have this bottleneck, okay? Because again, if you're declaring all biospecimens de-identifiable and identifiable as being considered human subjects, okay, then all this research, all the secondary research would be subject to the regulations, and one would have to get informed consent on all these biospecimens that have been collected in the past. And hence the research community was very opposed to these new regulations. And so, well, let me skip this. Now, the government, they asked for public comments on this proposed rules. And actually, a lot of patients and the research community was opposed. They were really concerned about the cost and logistics, and also they were concerned about slowing medical research, the public. And when the US government or the regulators got these public comments, they realized that, well, maybe the public are concerned about medical progress. And hence, they resolved the issue. And essentially, they said they dropped the proposal to make all biospecimens count as human subjects, even the identifiable biospecimens. And if de-identified, it would be considered non-human subject research, and hence no IRB review and no consent. So now there was a possibility of a consent waiver. And then they added this new option of the concept of broad concept in combination with limited IRB review. Looking forward, because now we knew we have all these problems with previously collected biospecimens, we wanted to know how we could move forward. And so we had this issue or this concept of broad consent. So what is broad consent? Broad consent is a term to use a research consent that's not specific to the primary research project, but instead it's non-specific consent that permits institutions to collect, store, and even use subject data and leftover biospecimens for future unspecified research, okay? And hence, you don't have to go back and ask for consent again. However, the broad consent has to be in combination of limited IRB review of the future research and also strong privacy safeguards. And that's why it's important to have a strong data protection law in your country. So essentially, now we're talking about moving forward so we don't have these problems in the future. Again, the issue is that we ask participants to give their broad consent for future unspecified research. And then in the future, when a research project comes along, there would be limited IRB review. Now, the limited IRB review would be the IRB would want to make sure that the previous broad consent is applicable to the future research or the research that's being proposed, and the IRB will make sure that there are strong privacy safeguards. So that would be the solution moving forward with this concept of broad consent. Yeah.
Is applicable to genetic studies?
Yes. I mean, why do you ask that?
I mean, if we think about a mother consenting genetic studies for the kids, her kids, and then later on she wants to be concerned about her child growing up, being an adult, would he or she accept their samples being used for any other?
You asked a good question, because all this doesn't apply.
Okay.
If there is the possibility of wanting to return the results back to the individuals, then you can't have broad consent in a way that you can't, you have to be able to, if you want to return the results back, then you need to reconsent the individuals, right? So this does not apply if your research proposal will include return of results back to the participants, right? Okay. Thank you for asking that question. So again, if you have not obtained study-specific consent or broad consent, there are only two alternatives: obtaining an IRB waiver of consent or removing personal identifiers. But if you have obtained informed consent, broad consent, you don't need a waiver of consent because you already have consent, and you don't have to remove personal identifiers because, again, you already have the broad consent.
Professor Henry, can I ask a question here?
Yes.
Professor Henry? Yes. We're talking about research and secondary research, or talking about clinical samples. So, for example, in a cancer clinic, and there's lots of patients coming, do I have to take consent from every single patient? I'm going to save the blood sample, for example, for future use.
If you think you're going to use these clinical samples in future research, then
yes,
you need to consent for a clinical test, and you need broad consent.
Yeah, clinical tests by default. I have to do it because it's investigation. Then in the future, the remaining sample, I save it in the future as a biobank. Then I use it for any further studies, for any further investigation in the future.
Right. So if you want to use it in the future, okay, without recontacting,
yeah,
you need broad consent.
All right. That means every single patient, maybe I need to ask him to sign.
That's right.
Broad consent.
That's
if I'm
right.
going to collect clinical sample.
This is a solution for the future. Okay.
Dr. Henry?
Yes.
May I know what are the elements of this broad consent?
Okay. Glad you asked.
I have a question on that slide later.
Which slide?
This one.
Yes.
Yeah, obtaining an IRB waiver and here one only is enough. It's mentioned or.
Obtain broad consent. You have to obtain you have to convince your IRB to grant you a waiver, which may be difficult depending on what your regulations specify for a waiver. Okay. Or you have to remove the personal identifiers. Okay. Again, that may limit the research possibilities of accessing the data again. So the issue is, well, in order to not bother with these issues, it's better to get broad consent for the future. Now, having said that, let me go to this slide. Now, does the public want broad consent? So again, now in the study we're doing with the public, asking their views, we're asking them, well, what do you think about broad consent? Is broad consent acceptable to you? Or there's this concept of tiered consent where the individual patient will say, listen, I don't like this business of broad consent. I don't like this business of you could do research, any type of research on my specimens. I want to tell you the range of diseases that you could do research on. Let's say I only want you to do research. Let's say I only want you to do research that's similar to the illness I have, like diabetes, or only cancer research. I don't want you doing research about schizophrenia, okay? Or I want to be recontact for any future research, or I want to be able to specify whether my data will be de-identified. So this is why we're doing the research with the public, because we want their point of view whether broad consent is acceptable. Several months ago, somebody from Saudi Arabia asked me about broad consent and whether their IRB could use the concept of broad consent. And I said, well, what does your public think about broad consent? So now the reason why I asked that, let me get to these slides here. Let me skip. I know I'm running out of. Yes. There are some concerns with broad consent. Okay. One, it requires an infrastructure to process broad consent. Essentially, how are you going to maintain what people said about broad consent? Now, what do you do with refusals? Does that mean you can't? I mean, I guess I'm asking, be careful of what you ask for. A lot of people may refuse. So here in this cartoon, this guy is saying, sign here to indicate you have no idea what you've signed. Okay? I mean, essentially, what will patients do when they're being asked for future unspecified research? Are they going to sign broad consent? Because if they refuse, then you can never use their specimens for research. Now, having said that, I guess one could say, all right, we have the biospecimens that we collected for clinical care or a previous research study. So essentially, what about if we de-identified the data? Could we still use their specimens even if they refuse broad consent? So now let me ask you, what do you do as an IRB if you get a proposal from an investigator who wants to use biospecimens that were previously collected for a previous research study, and now the investigators want to use the same specimens for a different research study? What do? Do you ask the investigators to recontact the subjects? Or what do you think you'll do? I think I asked you that question before, and some of you said recontact.
Yeah.
Some of you said waive the consent, and I think maybe one of you said de-identify the data. So you tell me, you as an IRB, what would you do? Also, do you have the concept of broad consent? Okay.
No, we don't. We don't have the concept of broad consent.
Okay. All right.
I've recently reviewed a few pharma-funded trials where they indicated the use of samples for broad consent for future genetic research, but they didn't. That part wasn't approved. They felt that there should be some specification from I guess an entity with commercial interest on what that future research might be.
Okay, so I guess, you had this multi-site research study from a drug company, and they were asking you, the investigators in the UAE, to collect extra specimens for future unspecified research, and you refused. Is that right?
I think it was sent back because it was a complete add-on from the.
It's an add-on, right?
Yeah, from the protocol, and I guess the committee was wary of giving sort of carte blanche approval for samples that could be used for commercialization, but particularly for the genetic samples.
Right. Yeah, but you're hindering medical progress.
Well, it was sent back to them for rebuttal, to respond to the committee's comments. So we'll see what they say.
Oh, I see. Well, what did you want them to revise?
I can't remember. I think it was just some clarification around. I think it was more. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, I would have to go back to the actual application. I think it was about more information and informed consent for the participant that their samples could be used in future research. I don't think that was in there.
Okay, which let me.
I think if you were going to establish biobank, Professor, I think if we're going to establish biobank or establish biodata, we're gonna need the broad consent. Going to be essential to have the broad consent.
Well, do you have a biobank in the UAE?
Not really, no.
Not yet.
Not yet, no. There is a notion to start or try talking about it among a few universities and a few hospitals, but at the moment we don't have a biobank as a national biobank or even biodata.
Well, if you, I mean, everybody else in your region is establishing biobanks, right?
Yes.
And if you're going to establish a biobank, and we'll talk next time about biobanks. Well, in order to get samples, you're going to have some kind of mechanism for broad consent, unless you intend to keep on recontacting individuals for their consent, which is a logistical nightmare. And you're not going to have a very good biobank if you're going to keep on doing that. So somebody asked, what are the mandated elements for broad consent? Well, a general description of the types of research that may be conducted with the identifiable private information or the identifiable biospecimens. Again, you want to be able to use data and biospecimens that are identifiable. So you have to have in the broad consent that you're going to store identifiable private information and biospecimens, okay? And a description of the type of information that's going to be stored. You're going to have to tell them who you're going to share these data and the biospecimens with. Investigators in other institutions in your countries, investigators in other countries. You have to tell the participants that you may share the data with investigators in other Arab countries or Europe countries or other Western countries, if that's what you intend to do, okay? You have to, let me get the next slide here. Whether the biospecimens will be used to generate a profit and whether the subject will share in this profit or not, whether the future research will include whole genome sequencing, and whether it's the intent to generate the genome or some sequence from that specimens. And then you have to talk about, other information, whether the participants will be contacted again in the future for any reason, whether the materials will be used for genetic testing, what are the confidentiality protections, what are the risks to privacy, will they be able to withdraw the stored samples? Let's say they read something in the newspapers and they want to call you up and say, listen, I want to withdraw my samples, whether they would receive any research results, and again, any commercial use of the samples. They did a study to see which of these options were in the actual consent forms, and we see that there was a large deficiency in the informed consent form. So again, when the broad consent has to mention all those different elements, okay, about who you're going to share it with, what are the privacy protections, will there be return of important results to the participants, will they be able to withdraw the samples, how long will the samples be stored, and what are the specific, as specific as you can be about future research. A lot of participants may want to make sure that the future research won't involve human cloning. That's a concern that should be in the consent form. And so, again, this is the issue for IRBs on what should be in the broad consent. And again, there's a concern that when you start establishing your biobank, you need to have the infrastructure to tabulate who has given broad consent. Well, a biobank could ask participants to either give extra blood in the clinic, or people in the biobank could go to the public individually to ask to donate a blood sample, whether they're in the clinic or not. So essentially, like the UK Biobank and the Biobank in Qatar are asking healthy individuals to specifically donate blood for their biobank. The bigger the biobank you have, the more important it would be to other investigators, because investigators, and we'll talk more about this next week, the investigators will want to access your biobank to do secondary research. Now, the investigators, most likely, they will want to access, well, they will access, well, let me back up. So essentially, when you establish the biobank, you have to have some kind of governance structure to detail how will other investigators access the biobank, and will they access de-identified information? And also, you know, what's the profit involved? What's the privacy protections? So there's all these issues involved with accessing the data. Let me end by discussing briefly this study we did back in 2010, where we asked the views of Egyptian patients about collection, storage, and use of blood samples for future research. Again, we're doing a current study involving more than 1,000 individuals from the public. This study involved 600 patients from the public and private clinics. And just briefly, we asked them, should consent forms provide an option for future research? And 44% agreed, but almost 40% said it should be restricted to the illness being studied. And so again, a lot of people in the public may not agree with this concept of broad consent. And then we asked them also whether could they give their specimens to other researchers without recontact. 53% said yes. Almost 30% wanted a right to withdraw. 30% wanted a right to share in the profits. 90% wanted results given back to them. And more than 60% said the samples could be used in future research. And then, let's see now, we asked them about sharing the data. Could samples be shared with investigators in another Arab country? Only 60% said yes. Could the samples be sent to a European country or a US country? And only about 40% said yes. And they asked, should there be government approval for sample exportation? And almost 90% said yes. Now,
interesting, very interesting data. Very interesting.
Right, yes. And now, I don't know if you know this, but in Egypt, the government prohibits the exportation of samples out of the country. And that's inhibiting a lot of research being done because it's very. I mean, we'll talk about this next time about the importance of sharing data with other countries.
You mean blood sample exportation or tissue?
Both. Any tissue sample, blood sample, and any tissue.
Because Egypt is involved in many international studies that involve blood collection that get exported to international labs.
No, it's not being done. It's not being permitted, and a lot of drug companies are pulling out.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. Because they can't do their studies in Egypt. Because they know it's very difficult. I mean, any drug company doing a multi-site research, okay, is gonna want to have the possibility of collecting extra blood for storage. That's the name of the game with the drug companies. They want to store the blood for future research. And I mean, you see it in the research you're reviewing. You're seeing the drug companies want to be able to store blood for future research because there's a lot of good research that could be done with the biospecimens and the data. And it's very important to be part of the global community with this research because the drug companies are developing different diagnostic tools that if certain regions in the world don't participate in this data sharing, the future discoveries may not be applicable to the genetic makeup of your region.
And for precision medicine.
Next time about the whole issue about data sharing. But it's, there's already been cases in which they've developed certain genetic testing for, I think, cervical cancer or something like that, or treatment. However, most of the data has been obtained from Western countries, and hence the treatments, getting back to precision medicine, you know, every region has a different genetic profile.
Yep.
And if you're not, but not every region has the infrastructure to do the genetic analysis. And so there is this concept about sharing your biospecimens to the global community, but we'll talk more about that next time. So, so there's some stuff that I'll leave for next time. We're been here almost 2.5 hours, and I get the feeling that you think this is interesting stuff, and it is. So let me save some of this stuff next time, okay? And essentially summarize what we talked about. add some resources on the website. So I sent you some articles already about these important issues. So again, just to briefly summarize, so again, we talked about the concept of secondary research on biospecimens that have been collected in the past, and we see the problems with that. How do we access those previously collected biospecimens? Do we need to recontact? Do we instead waive the consent? Are we able to waive the consent, or do we have to de-identify the specimens? What do your regulations say? Do your regulations need to be updated to cover all these possibilities? What do your regulations say about exempt research? Because if it's exempt, then you may not need to have prolonged IRB review or consent. And what do you do moving forward? What do you do about broad consent? And Tom, you mentioned about doing that study in the UAE, which I said is an excellent idea, and I'll share with you, as I said before, the survey we're doing in those countries. I'm happy to share with you the survey, and I have it in English, and I also have it in Arabic. Okay, so
good for the UAE.
What's that?
It would be good to conduct it on a UAE community. We'll see their feedback.
I think it would be, and because right now we're doing the study, as I said before, in Egypt, Jordan, Sudan, and Morocco, and so we have the survey in Arabic, okay, and we've already collected almost 1,000 people from the public who have completed the survey, and so these are some very important issues on the table that you know, if you want to continue to be part of the international community, this is what is happening. So why don't we continue next week? We'll finish up some of the issues I didn't get a chance to talk about, and then we'll talk more about biobanks next week, and about the whole issue about data sharing. Any remaining thoughts?
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed the articles, Prof. They were very interesting.
Very good. I'll keep them coming.
It was my afternoon reading.
Thank you very much. Very interesting session and very interesting articles.
Okay. All right, guys. You have a good evening, and we'll continue these issues next time. Okay. All right. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Henry. Good night, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Okay, good night. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.